Welcome home to St. Anne's. We want you to know that you're welcome to join us at 10 a.m. on Sundays. Please be sure to hit subscribe to receive our sermons. We can't wait to meet you.
I love you all so much. We're going to keep things short today. So normally, if you're used to me, normally I preach on the gospel because I think the gospel's kind of the heart of who we are as Christians. But at the same time, if I preach the gospel today, it will be the same sermon as last week. And even I get sick of hearing me say the same things over and over again. Like, I have 3 sermons, basically. You guys have heard them on repeat for 10 years. So today we're going to preach on Paul, which is kind of a big deal because Paul and I have a love-hate relationship. Very similar to when I was growing up, I had a love-hate relationship with Mary, and I've talked a little bit about that. Paul and I have that same relationship. And it's really because, and it's probably less Paul's fault and more what we've done with Paul. Because remember, the texts of Paul are written in the school of Paul, okay? So each letter is not necessarily from Paul. Okay, so we're going to do a brief history of Paul and why this matters today. Okay, so Paul has his vision, right? And he decides to go into ministry. You know, it's kind of the par for all of us. That's how you end up in ministry. No one chooses it because it seems like a great idea at the time. It's really more like you get forced into it. And that's what happens to Paul. And so he's traveling around. He's what we call a tent maker. And we talk about those now. So kind of more of a church planter in today's way. They tend to be more charismatic and more fabulous than those of us who are like stay somewhere for a while because we don't go anywhere. We're just like, we're here. But so Paul is traveling around and he plants these little churches. And so then he leaves and he goes somewhere else. And so the people in that community are worshiping and writing in the school of Paul, right? And so then Paul will go somewhere else, but he still stays in contact usually in churches. And he'll write back and forth, usually to the leaders of those churches, which is why you'll notice in a lot of his texts that they're written to women. Because, and this is where Paul gets, oh my gosh, there are no kids in here. Paul gets bastardized into hating women. And that happens later. But in reality, most of the early churches are run by women. Because who has time? Wealthy women have time, right? And so those are where the churches kind of collect, is around wealthy women. Because they've got time and they have the resources to host us. And frankly, wealthy women have time. That's why churches, we love them. Anyway, so that's one of the things that kind of happens to Paul later, that we get this idea that Paul hates women. Absolutely untrue. His disciples are frequently female. The churches that he plants are frequently run by females. You'll notice a lot of his letters are written to women. But later, some of our letters get written in the school of Paul, and so we pick up this anti-female, anti-Semitic, anti-other groups, right? So that's why sometimes Paul seems like Paul is all over the place. And it's less because Paul is all over the place, literally. And the letters get written in different ways. Why does all of that matter? Because it matters because you and I have the same issues that the churches that Paul is writing to. And I want us to focus on Timothy today because I feel like Timothy can speak to us, all right? So this letter is written to Timothy. Now, did you notice that Paul is actually referencing female leaders in Timothy's family? Okay, there's a reason he's doing that. Timothy, however, is in a crisis of faith. We've never been there, so maybe I shouldn't preach this sermon. Anyone ever been in a crisis of faith? Like me all the time, where we're like, well, what's the point of even doing this? This is a waste of time, right? Because we look around us and we're like, the world is going Still no kids. They're still hanging out somewhere else. The world is going to hell, right? And we're like, what is the point? Like, I've offered my entire life. This is a quote from me. I've offered my entire life to God, right? My entire life. My ministry started at 16. That's when I decided to go into the ministry. 16. My entire life has been devoted to this. Okay. It doesn't seem to be working. Anyone else have a crisis of faith ever? Yes. Timothy is like, what's the point? It doesn't seem to be working. Everything's going on around me. This is a waste of our time. And Paul says, Timothy, God love you. Love you, Timothy. You're cute. You're real cute. Let's talk about what ministry is actually about, shall we, Timothy? And this is where it gets important. You and I struggle with shame. And that is an important term. Did you pick that word up in this reading? It's so very, very important because we call these feelings all sorts of other things, right? Self-righteous indignation, anger, frustration. It's all pointless. It's useless. We're doing all these things. It all comes down to shame. And I want us to examine shame. Because you think that you feel embarrassed. You think that you feel angry. You think that you feel all these things. Dig down. Dig really deep down. Why am I upset that I'm not a successful priest? Why do we sometimes struggle when the churches seem empty? Why? Because we are afraid of feeling shame. We feel ashamed. I feel ashamed that I use a cane. I feel ashamed of that. I feel ashamed that other people that I went to seminary with are becoming bishops and have big cardinal parishes. I feel ashamed because I know that my test scores were higher. I know that. And I know that my calling is just as real as anyone else's. Sometimes I feel ashamed. Do you ever feel ashamed when you go on Facebook? And you think that you feel jealous. You think that you feel anger. You think that you feel whatever. You probably feel shame. Because when we compare our lives to others, we start to feel ashamed. When we compare our churches to others, we start to feel ashamed. When we feel our denomination is compared to others, especially if you're in Missouri, the Episcopal Church in Missouri is not exactly like top tier. Okay? This is the land of the Baptists, with a few Lutherans scattered throughout. And the Methodists have kind of a stronghold, but they still kind of want to be non-denominational. Have you noticed that? Yeah. Even the Methodists have given up on Missouri. We feel ashamed. So dig down into that shame. What is that shame really about? Because Timothy feels ashamed. Do you ever feel ashamed to say that you're a Christian with other people? Do you? I do. Do you ever feel ashamed to say I'm an Episcopalian because A, people don't even know what that means and can't say it? And you're like, whatever. Do you feel ashamed? Do you feel ashamed of your health, your appearance, what you do for a career and a living? Do you feel like you have to rephrase it? Do you feel ashamed of where you live? Do you? What is that about? Because when we dig into that, my shame has nothing to do with God. My shame of my ministry has nothing to do with God. Because if I dig down, I know that almost every single day I have chosen to follow Christ. Even if that is the wrong choice. Wrong choice. I know that this church every step of the way since the day it was opened, has committed itself to God's call. To God's call here in Lee Summit, to God's call here in the Diocese of West Missouri, to God's call in Missouri, to God's call in the United States. Every single day, this church has committed to that. And yet we feel ashamed, don't we? And when we do those choices, I want us to dig down about what that shame is really about. If you feel shame about the way you look, if you feel shame about your life, what is that really about? Is your shame about God? Or is your shame about what it looks like, what you think it looks like to other people? Because I'm going to tell you something. If we are living committed to God, it's going to look shameful to everyone else. Because what God defines and calls us to is so very, very different. It's revolutionary. What God calls us to is revolution. And it doesn't look great to the rest of the world. It looks ridiculous, and it looks absurd, and frankly, it looks shameful. And there are days when you're going to feel embarrassed. And it's okay. It's okay in those moments to feel embarrassment. To sometimes be like, oh, I don't really want to acknowledge that I'm a Christian right now. I don't really want to acknowledge that I believe this right now. Because sometimes it feels uncomfortable. And God, friends, feels uncomfortable. If you are following God, you are shameful. But I'm going to tell you something much more important. When we look to God, will we be ashamed of the choices we've made? Because that's what matters. Not whether or not I look ashamed when other people look at me or other people judge me, but when I look to God, when I look to my calling, when I look to my ministry, when we look to our church, and we look to God, do we feel ashamed? Do we feel ashamed of selling out? Do we feel ashamed of choosing money over ministry? Do we feel ashamed of choosing the career that we chose over doing something for more money that maybe involved killing puppies? Because a lot of jobs that make a lot of money involve what I call killing puppies. Do we realize that maybe you don't feel 100% right? Because that's when we should feel shame. We should feel shame when we've sold out. Because at the end of the day, it was about God all the time. At the end of the day, it was about love and justice and mercy the whole time. And I'm going to tell you, love, justice, and mercy doesn't sell well. It doesn't preach well. And it sure as heck doesn't bring in the dollars. But love, justice, and mercy, when we look in the face of God, will leave us not feeling ashamed. Did I do short? Fairly short.
We want you to know that you're welcome to join us at 10 a.m. on Sundays.
Not short.
Please be sure to hit subscribe to receive our sermons. We can't wait to meet you.